Welcome to Pioneer Mindset, a place where we challenge our mindset and address the discomfort in both business and life by finding clarity resulting in bold conviction. I'm your host, Garrett Ruskamp, fifth generation farmer, husband, and father from rural Nebraska. Whether you're navigating frustration from past decisions or worry about the uncertainty you face today in your business, we're going to learn from our struggles and take on new challenges with a resilient mindset. Join me as I share my journey of struggles I faced in agriculture as a farmer and family man. I'm ready to dive into honest conversations to tackle the mindsets surrounding key issues that rural ag business owners face that will ultimately help you gain control, leading to a profitable and sustainable business. Let's adapt to Pioneer Mindset and get to it. Welcome back, everyone, to this week's episode of Pioneer Mindset. So, which expenses in your operation, within your farming operation or business, which expenses do you feel like are a need versus a want? So this is exactly what we're going to be diving into on this week's episode, and just almost kind of the mindset behind money and the different things that we spend money on. All right, so before we dive into this, I want to kind of give you a little bit of context as to the thought process I had here, what got me to be thinking about this. All right, so about a week ago, I actually had a conversation with Mary Jo Irmen from Farming Without the Bank. Now, if you're not familiar with Mary Jo, by all means, go check her out. She's got a podcast. She's got a book that's a really good, valuable book that's really easy to comprehend. And that talks about basically this infinite banking concept, using life insurance policies to fund your operation, to fund a death benefit. That's going to be very important for, those around us and our family members, right? And so I was actually having a conversation with her about a week ago, just trying to learn a little bit more. And so within that, I'm not going to dive in too deep into this, but within that conversation, one of the thoughts that she had was it just kind of almost around, life insurance, should life insurance be a necessity, right? Obviously someday we are going to die. It always kind of goes back to that famous phrase is the only two things that are certain in life are death and taxes, right? So someday we are going to die. But when it comes to life insurance and some of these other things, we have this thought process that maybe it's not necessarily a necessity, all right? We have all these other things that might be almost a non-negotiable, okay? All of these other things in our life, all of these other things in our business, or these things that we spend money on, all these expenses, whatever that is, we feel like we've got all these things that are a non-negotiable, but when it comes to life insurance, when it comes to even investing, or even profit for that matter, it seems like it's always an afterthought. It seems like it's always an if-then thought. All right, so what do I mean by an if-then thought? If we have the money, then we can spend it on, or then we can invest into life insurance, invest into, investments, right? Then if we can produce the profit, then we can do these things that we want to do. All right, it's not a necessity. So it kind of brought up this thought process for me of, okay, what expenses are a need versus a want? Do you see life insurance as a need, or is it a want, or is it a luxury to some extent? All right, so that's kind of another variable there, is considering it a luxury. And if we consider it a luxury, a lot of times we're not going to prioritize it. We're not going to get to the point where we are diligent about, putting our money into those certain things and spending our money on those things. So it got me really thinking about how we view our expenses or the things that we spend money on. So we're going to be diving into a couple different things here, a couple different sectors. Now, before we get into that, another thing here I really want to talk about is a book that I read a while back called Profit First. All right, this is written by Mike Michalowicz. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Kind of a tricky name there, but overall, really good guy. And I once again, I always say I read it, but I actually listen to it if I'm being completely honest. I like to listen to books because that's how I consume books the best. But I did actually get the physical copy of this one after I listened to it, so that way I could dive deeper into it. But the whole thought behind this is pretty simple. It's profit first. All right, really flipping the business mindset that we have so that we focus on profit first. Profit should be a priority. So are we really focusing on that priority first? Back to this whole flipping the business mindset. For farmers, for business owners, this is our typical mindset. Okay, we're going to go produce this thing or provide this service, and this is going to generate, some income, right? And then in order to figure out what our profit is, well, we take our income minus our expenses equals profit. That's just kind of that standard equation there, really simplifying things. All right, well, now with this book, Profit First, and Mike, we went ahead and really flipped this, okay? We really flipped it to where he's talking about income minus profit equals expenses. Okay, so just kind of flipping that second part of that is, so we take our income minus our profit, then that equals what our expenses will be. Okay, so that's really backwards. But after we get to thinking about the book and after we're going to dive into a couple things here today, I feel like that completely makes sense. Okay, and so with that, we think about all these expenses, like I mentioned before, that are probably in our head a non negotiable, right? So they're going to have to be there. And we feel like all of our expenses to some extent are a non negotiable. Okay, and so with the example that he actually gave in the book, and like I said, is really beneficial because he actually narrated the audiobook, which made it really easy to understand. Really interesting guy. Go give him a follow. Go get the book on this one as well. But this, what he was talking about, one of the examples that he gave within the book was actually thinking about a tube of toothpaste similar to our expenses in our business. Okay, so follow me with this one. When you get a brand new tube of toothpaste and you crack it open out of the box, or you buy it and you first crack that open and you start putting that big old slob on your toothbrush there, the odds are when there's a plentiful amount there, we use probably more than what we could or should or is a necessity, right? So we use more of that. So all of a sudden, at the beginning, first half of the tube of toothpaste, we feel like we're using so much. And then as the tube gets a lot smaller and there's less in there, okay, well, I don't need that much. I just put a little bit less in my toothbrush. And when it gets to the end and we're literally rolling it up, trying to squeeze every little drop of toothpaste out of that tube onto our toothbrush, as long as we get just this little dot, enough to kind of at least get a couple of our teeth, right? That's good enough. It gets the job done. We at least say we can brush our teeth and we move on, right? That's the exact same thing when it comes to our expenses. Okay, so that's why we're trying to flip this. And that's why he does a really good job of talking about flipping this mindset to income minus profit equals expenses. So we're taking our profit before we actually have all these other expenses. So if we know that at the end of the day, if we only have this much left of money to cover all of our expenses, we're going to get pretty darn efficient on all these expenses. We're not going to need an entire toothbrush full of toothpaste to get the job done, right? We're going to be able to really dial in our expenses, figure out which ones are a need versus a want. And that's exactly why I thought this was kind of relevant, thinking about this mindset around money, right? And kind of how we process this, right? And so really thinking about this and really, how do we think about the expenses that we have? Okay. Do we see them as, once again, a non-negotiable? Okay. And so I want to kind of throw out a disclaimer here before we get too deep into the weeds and before we keep diving into this. There's really no right or wrong answers here when it comes to the mindset you have around money. But I will say there's no right or wrong answers unless what you're doing isn't working. So that's to where we can kind of really put that hard stop on there. There's no right or wrong answer when we dive into this conversation, unless what you're doing currently is not working. Well, obviously, that's maybe not right. That's maybe not right. And so that's where we need to kind of flip this mindset a little bit and shift it, right? It's pioneer mindset. That's what we're doing here. Okay. So around that same thought process is, I feel like oftentimes, especially when it comes to farming, the row crop industry, the cattle industry, commodity production, if you will. All right. We're talking about thin margins. We're talking about how can we do the best that we can to squeak out a profit. Okay. So a lot of times we tell ourselves when it comes to, spending money on these expenses and justifying a lot of these expenses is all of these expenses that we have, if we don't have enough income to cover these expenses, then the system is broken. Once again, we tell ourselves that a lot of these expenses that we have are a necessity. They are a need. But if we do not have enough income to cover these expenses, basically we do not have a profit, then the system is broken. And then we start blaming somebody else. All right. So I feel like that's the day and age that we are in today, especially within the row crop sector. We're facing a lot of hard times. 24 was rough, 25 was rough. The odds are most folks lost money to some extent. All right. But we tell ourselves that if we lose money, the system is broken. And I know this is a whole rabbit hole we could dive into. And I'm not trying to say that if you lost money this last year, it was completely your fault. I mean, within agriculture, within farming, there's so much that is out of our control, whether it be the weather, the markets, the inputs, all this other stuff. There's so much out of our control. I'm not trying to dive into this rabbit hole. But at the end of the day, if we want to get in the business of making money, and we are, after all, in the business of making money, we are running a farm business. We want to do the best that we can to make a profit consistently year over year so we can stay in business, so we can survive. so we can continue this legacy and this lifestyle we've built to pass it down to the next generation, yada, yada. I always mention that stuff, right? So when we talk about this, I'm not saying that it's necessarily your fault that we didn't make money or we lost money, but we got to ask ourselves, are we just constantly blaming the system, thinking that the system is broken? And yes, there's a lot of things that within the system that might be broken, but if we want to control what we can control, this is what it comes down to right here. Is if we want to control the things that we can control, that's what we need to focus on. That's where we need to shift this mindset and really focus on, how are we viewing these expenses and what's our mindset around this money side of things, right? So when it comes to the profit side, all right, when it comes to making a profit, there's really only two ways that we can make more profit at the end of the day. All right, pretty simple. We can increase revenue or we can decrease expenses. We've always heard that. I had an agronomist I was talking about the other day, or a while back, I should say, trying to figure out how we can be more profitable. And on the increasing revenue side, when we're in commodity production, talking about row crops here, we can do two things. We can raise more of what we're selling, so we have more to sell, more revenue per acre, more bushels out there, or we can sell those bushels for more dollars. Okay. Ideally, we want to do both. But at the end of the day, that's how we do the two sides, how we increase that revenue. On the flip side, how do we decrease expenses? Well, that's pretty common. Okay, if we've got to kind of go back to the tube of toothpaste, right? Maybe we've got all these expenses out here right now. How can we shave some of those off? How can we be more efficient? How can we not use as much? Or how can we just really dial that in, hone that in, so that way we can, once again, try to go about this kind of formula here of making more profit, okay? And so within that, trying to think through what are the things that we can ultimately do. And that's where I'm going with this, and trying to kind of get your mindset, your gears kind of turning here as to what we can actually do. Going back to the theme of this episode, which expenses are a need versus a want. And so that's where we're going to kind of talk about this next. Where this mindset around money, I think it kind of comes down to two things here. All right. When you have a mindset around money and how you operate around that, I feel like it comes down to either a scarcity mindset or an abundance mindset. And you can flip back and forth. This isn't a hard left, hard right sort of thing. You can kind of flip back and forth, depends on the season that you're in or the challenges that you faced or whatever that might be. But it's either a scarcity or abundance mindset. A lot of the decisions we make, we can really sit back and analyze, okay, am I making this out of a scarcity mindset or abundance mindset? And furthermore, kind of simplifying that a little bit further is, are we really focused on opportunity or just survival? And I will say, caveat to this is there's got to be a dichotomy. There has to be a dichotomy in everything that we do. And the dichotomy basically means there's got to be a balance. There's at certain times, certain seasons that we might be in, we need to have an opportunity-focused mindset. And then certain times, maybe we are literally just on survival. And surviving at the end of the day might be the best that we can do, okay? And so just realizing kind of what mindset we are utilizing and we are in when we're making these different decisions, okay? When we're trying to focus on these different expenses, as we're talking about within this episode, all right? So as we kind of keep moving here and focusing on the expenses, and this is really, really where kind of the meats of it that I was trying to go to here. All right, specifically, which expenses are a need versus a want, and really dialing that in, because it kind of all funnels back to what I mentioned to before. If we could dial in what expenses are a need versus a want, we are then going to be able to hone in and make our business more efficient. And even furthermore, kind of back to what Mike was saying in his book, Profit First. Okay, if we say right now our mindset is, the business mindset we have is, okay, we're going to raise this amount of income, this is our expenses, and then this is the profit left over. Flipping that equation to where we've got, okay, this is our income, but we minus our profit first, and then we equal our expenses. So when we only have a limited number of expenses, when we've already taken off our profit first, because profit is, at the end of the day, a priority, right? If that profit to you is a priority, and we need that profit to be a priority in order to stay in the business long term, then we're only going to have a certain amount of basically number of expenses that we can take. All right. Whatever's left over is the expenses that we can take, the things that we can spend money on within the business. Okay. So this is where we're trying to evaluate, okay, if at the end of the day, I've only got $500 of expenses per acre that I can spend money on, $500 left to spend money on per acre. But yet right now, my cost of production shows it's going to be $700. How do we shave off $200? And that might be pretty darn extreme to you. But at the end of the day, we got to ask ourselves, what's the alternative if we don't do that? Yeah, lose money, right? Lose money. Or if we don't take that profit first, that's usually kind of the mindset that we have there is, okay, maybe we want to shoot for $100 an acre profit. So right now, maybe the way our mindset works is we've got $800 worth of expenses into our corn crop. All right. I'm really trying to think on the fly here, but okay, maybe $800 of income per our corn crop is what we're expected to make. I mean, easy math on that would be 200 bushel corn, $4 an eight bushel. We got $800 of income or revenue per acre. But maybe our expenses at this point are actually $900. So we're underwater. Okay. So that means there's actually a loss there. Okay. There's no profit. There's a loss there. Okay. So maybe we do the best that we can to shave off $100. So now we get to where we're at a break even. There's still no profit there. But if our goal is to make $100 profit, okay, $100 profit, then that means that we need to get our expenses, our cost of production per that acre, we need to get that below our revenue. So at $700. Okay, so now our expenses need to equal $700 per acre. Kind of flipping that, working backwards to some extent, trying to figure out how do we calculate this profit in first? Which expenses are a need versus a want in order to get us to that point? That's what we're ultimately trying to figure out here. That's what we're trying to reverse engineer and really make sure that we're being efficient. Versus, okay, well, looks like my cost of production is $900. Can't do much about it. The system's broken. I can't make a profit. What are we going to do about this? Please hand out some money. Oops, went there. Sorry, didn't even mean to. I'm not trying to ruffle some feathers. I understand there's a lot of things that are working against us sometimes in agriculture, a lot of things out of our control. But at the end of the day, if we want to get our businesses, not just row crop production or commodity production within agriculture, to get to where we are consistently making a profit, consistently cash flowing, and having something left to provide for our family and even provide for future growth, this is where we need to shift this to be a priority. Okay. And so back to these expenses and really diving into which ones are need versus want. Okay, so I want to actually take a side step here to a thought process that a good friend of mine, Josh Pretzer, had. Josh Pretzer from Singular Agronomics. Go check out their podcast. Go follow him on both of them, Josh Pretzer and Singular Agronomics, on a lot of the social media platforms. Really good group of guys there. Talk a lot about some interesting concepts. But overall, what he had mentioned one time on an episode was literally going almost and evaluating all of your different, at this point, was maybe your different crop inputs, and asking yourselves, why are each of these important? What's the why behind each one of these expenses? And not only maybe your crop inputs, but just all of our expenses. Okay. Asking ourselves the why behind these. Furthermore, what happens if we do not apply this? We do not do this. We don't spend this money on this. What actually happens? Okay. And just knowing exactly what that outcome is, knowing exactly why we're doing this, maybe there are a lot of these things that aren't non-negotiable that we do need to spend money on. You know, it's pretty hard to raise a crop if we don't put the seed in the ground, right? And so those are a lot of things that I don't want to say dive into, but we just need to kind of go almost line item by line item, category by category, and really ask ourselves, you know, what can we do here? Why are these expenses important? What happens if we don't do this? And furthermore, you know, do we need all of these expenses? You know, do we need these things because everyone else has them? Because we're trying to keep up with the Joneses? Because it makes you feel good? Maybe on the equipment side of things, maybe we're over-equipped. Maybe we're doing a lot of things there that aren't truly necessary, aren't truly a need. Okay, maybe they're just more wants. Maybe they're more comfort factor side of things. Okay, we'll get to that here just in a second as well. So that's where we can just literally go line item by line item. You know, whatever your cash flow looks like, whatever your cost of production looks like. All right, so I'm going to spend, you know, I'm going to put 120 pounds of nitrogen out there. Why are we doing that? Okay, what's the answer behind that? Okay, you know, if we got a justified answer, okay, let's move on. Why do we have this combine payment? Okay, well, let's work through that. Why are we spending all this money on all these random supplies? You know, are they necessary? Is there just something that when I'm at Baumgart's or at the local supply store that this would be nice? I really want this. You know what I mean? What are all of these expenses adding up to? And at the end of the day, you know, are we profitable with all of these expenses, or do we need to shave some of these expenses? Okay. Do we need to shift our mindset so that way we are focusing on the profit first? So that way we are asking ourselves, really dialing it in. Is this a need versus a want? Okay. And so with this, kind of to shift this a little bit, to kind of keep moving here, almost kind of the last comment on this, or there's something else to kind of really think about before we round this out and kind of summarize everything here. But I think a lot of this does come down to fear. Okay, so when we look at the different expenses that we do have and trying to shave this off as much as possible, trying to really just trim this down, especially when we get into hard times. Obviously, when we're in good times, when we got $7 corn, $14 beans, we're making money. It's pretty easy to spend the money. We're making profit because going back to the equation that's in our head, we've got income minus expenses, and there's something left over. Okay, it's a lot easier to go through those times, a lot less fearful as well, typically, right? Typically. Now, when we're in the flip side of that, when we're in the times that we are facing here in row crop production, to where when we use that common kind of equation there, income minus expenses, and it's a negative number, there's no profit left over. Now, how can we kind of flip that? And a lot of times when we're looking at those expenses, it might be kind of fear based as to why we don't necessarily want to cut some of these things out. Why do we don't want to reduce our nitrogen? Well, we're fearful that it's going to hurt our yield. Well, that's maybe pretty valid, but is there any merit to that? Is there any truth to that? All right. So, or are we fearful? Why are we fearful to go away from X brand of seed, go to something cheaper, to do something different there, to go away from even raising corn and soybeans, do something different there? What's the fear? I feel like there's a lot of fear behind a lot of those things. The reason why we don't necessarily make those hard decisions. And so with that, it got me to thinking about when it comes to fear, where does that come from, and some of the different thoughts and mindsets that we have. And so I'll say when it comes to maybe if you're a generational farm, maybe you're second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh generation, whatever you are on your farm, that's great. There's so much pride in that. But a lot of times there's more than just assets that get passed down on a generational farm. And what I'm talking about here is not only whether it be the assets or the opportunities that we have within a generational farm, but what about the thought processes? What about the mindsets? What about the frameworks that we have, or even the decision making? Okay. So a lot of times we're just taught, trained, and conditioned to think a certain way. And when have a generational farm where we spend a lot of our time working with the generation prior to us, we were raised by the generation prior to us that has their own thoughts, experiences with the world. They've got their own worldview of how things they should operate and how things have worked for them in the past, their learning experiences that they've had. A lot of times those bleed down to us. They bleed down to that next generation as we're trying to raise them and prune them and help them out, whether it be consciously or even subconsciously, intentionally, unintentionally, they do bleed down. All right. This happens all the time. And I can speak for this myself, being, fifth generation on our operation. I can speak to that wholeheartedly. When it comes to, say, the work ethic that we have, being afraid to actually work less hours because you feel less than because we haven't spent the hours out there that maybe others are. That's very common. Being afraid to cut our nitrogen below such and such a point because it's going to raise less yield, and yield is king, right? Yield pays the bills. Well, it might, but it might not. There might not be enough of it out there to cover all of your expenses, right? And so that just kind of goes back to those different thoughts and frameworks that we have, even if we're a generational farm. And so that's why there's actually a lot of advantages that can come from being a first generation farmer and can have almost a leg up. They don't necessarily have all those different things that they were taught, trained, conditioned over the years, maybe the different things that they had even witnessed or their family had witnessed and all the challenges that they've been through. If they don't have that, they can maybe almost have this more of an open mindset. Well, I don't need to use X brand of seed because our family's been doing business there for 30 years. I can go elsewhere where it's cheaper, where it's more reliable, where there's more bang for my buck, where it's going to actually give me an opportunity to have a potential for a profit, right? Or maybe just cutting these things because I don't need them. All right. I've never had these luxuries. I didn't have this on our farm before, so I don't even need to worry about it. All right. So that's where when we become a generational farm or a first generation farm, you can actually almost have a leg up because we've got a different way of thinking, a way of thinking that isn't to some extent tainted by the generation before us. Nothing wrong with that. There could be a lot of pros that come from those generational ways of thinking as well. But in this thought process here, trying to make sure that we can flip this mindset to focusing on the things that are important, to focusing on the priorities, to focusing on the needs, not just the wants. All right. So that way there is profit left over at the end of the day. There is something left over to carry your operation, first generation or fifth, doesn't matter, on to the next generation, preserving that lifestyle and that legacy that you've worked so hard to build. So that's exactly what we're talking about here. And we got to remember that. Okay, we ask ourselves, going back to the system is broken. Don't mean to keep bringing that up. But if we don't flip this script, what happens? What's the alternative to keeping the mindset of income minus expenses equals profit. And if there's not profit left over, what's the alternative? What's going to happen? What's the worst case scenario? And by the way, when we're factoring all these expenses, I got to throw this in here. The income side is pretty easy, especially if you're in commodity row crop production. I did that math just before. 200 bushels per acre times $4, $800 an acre in revenue. The expense is a little bit more tricky. We got to get these expenses dialed in. We got to have some tools or some ways to make sure that we're accounting for everything. We're not forgetting about anything either. That's so very common, especially when it comes to these expenses. It's pretty easy to figure out, okay, I spent X amount on seed and fertilizer, fungicide, fuel, maybe even combine payments, all those things. But what about the things that add up that we do not always account for? Maybe the interest on the loans, maybe we got these random supplies, maybe we got cost of living in there, maybe we got our wages thrown in there, maybe we got utilities thrown in there, all these things that just add up so fast. All right. So just making sure that we are not forgetting about all of those when we're doing this calculation, when we're doing this equation. And so just trying to, go through each one of those expenses, line item by line item, category by category, which one is a need versus a want. So as we get to rounding this out today, I know we covered a lot of areas here, but I hope that there's something that you could take away. And so I want to summarize this real quick to kind of put this all together of the different areas that we covered, because we first started this conversation talking about life insurance. Then we're talking about a tube of toothpaste. Then we're talking about first generational farmers. We've covered a lot of area here. So that's where I would just want to kind of throw this all together in a quick little summary to round this out, to kind of give you something to take home, action items to kind of take home, so to speak. All right. So think about a lot of these things, even going back to the life insurance and the investing and the way that you're currently managing your money. Okay. You can either be uncomfortable now or you can be uncomfortable later. All right. So going back to thinking about, if we don't have enough income to cover all of expenses and have a profit at the end of the day, a lot of times it can be really uncomfortable. There can be a lot of fear in making those cuts, making those decisions, and how we go about trimming up those expenses, so to speak. And it can be really uncomfortable. Maybe it's dialing back from that 8R series to an older model tractor. All right. Maybe it's cutting some things that, are really nice to have. They're a want. Okay. But we got to ask ourselves, do we want to be uncomfortable now or be uncomfortable later? Currently, I feel like when we talk about investing in life insurance and setting some money aside for retirement, we feel like we don't have enough there to just cover those different almost expenses, if we will. We see them as expenses. We don't see them as necessities. We don't see them as a non-negotiable. We see them as something that's a luxury. And we feel like we don't have enough to cover those right now. So therefore, we don't necessarily want to be, I think if at the end of the day, it's admitting that we don't want to be uncomfortable in order to cover those different expenses now, so that way we can be comfortable later. So ask yourself that question is, do we want to be comfortable now or comfortable later? Okay. And being honest with yourself, because if we are being honest, and if we are truly thinking about the future, we all would rather be uncomfortable now and more comfortable later in life. That being said, are you willing to do what it takes now? Putting profit first and things that are a priority first. Okay. Asking yourself, are a lot of these expenses, are a lot of these things that we're spending money on, personally and in the business, are they a need versus a want? Okay. So that's ultimately what I want to challenge you with here now and leave you with this, is to analyze these things, flip this mindset, this business mindset, so that way we are not just leaving profit left at the end of the day. If there's something left over, that's my take home, right? Versus if we do want to be profitable, sustainable, and viable long term, taking profit first, taking the things that are necessity first, and prioritizing those first. Okay. So how can you go look at your cost of production, starting there? How can you look at your cash flow? What can we do to overall basically increase our profit? That might be going, like I said before, having that dichotomy between opportunity focused and survival focused, scarcity and abundance. Maybe we can have this part where we focus on increasing revenue. Okay. Maybe we can focus on what can we do to bring in more income on the top end front, right? And then hopefully doing kind of a two-part there. Okay. Maybe we're increasing revenue, but decreasing expenses, overall increasing profit. Okay. So what can you do now to go focus on those things? Really work on a system in place. If you don't have one, put together your cost of production, put that together, know exactly what all these numbers actually are, so we're not forgetting anything. really evaluating where you're sitting today from a cost production standpoint and which one of these expenses is a need versus a want, and really honing in on that. And so, last thing I need you to do after you get done with that, or after you even get done with listening to this episode, would really appreciate it if you follow along, like this episode, give me a comment. I appreciate any feedback that you might have. If this is something that's a new concept for you, you never thought about it, if this is something that you're already doing and you've really honed it in, by all means, I would love to hear your feedback on that. And then would really love to have a conversation if you'd like to learn more about this or how you can implement some of these different mindsets for yourself, for your business, even on the personal side as well. So that's all I got for this week's episode, folks. Appreciate it, and we will catch you guys next time. Thanks for tagging along with me today as we sharpened our mindsets. If you've gained insight from today's episode, be sure to take a screenshot to share or send this episode to somebody who might also find value in it. For more, follow me on Instagram @GarrettRuskamp or on Facebook, and join me next time for more conviction through clarity.